Well, good afternoon, everybody, and good evening to our friends in Ireland and the UK. I was just waiting for the number of participants to exceed 100, which it just did. So there's my cue to start. For those of you I haven't met in person or more recently online, I'm Kevin Kenny. I'm the director of Glucksman Ireland House. And we have a very special event today, which I've been eagerly awaiting for the last several months as we examine the work of Seamus Heaney, a great friend of Ireland House, from the perspective of Roy Foster, one of Ireland's most distinguished historians and literary critics. Roy Foster is Professor of Irish History and Literature at Queen Mary University and Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Oxford. Before that, as most of you know, he was the Carroll Professor of Irish History at Oxford. And in that position, he shaped the direction of Irish historical writing in Ireland, the United Kingdom, and North America more than any historian of his generation. Among Professor Foster's outstanding works are his biographies of Charles Stewart Parnell, Lord Randolph Churchill, and of course W.B. Yeats, as well as a major interpretive survey, Modern Ireland, 1600 to 1972, and most recently, Vivid Faces, the Revolutionary Generation in Ireland, 1890 to 1939. Roy is also a brilliant essayist and a prominent public intellectual. When his students and colleagues put together a festschrift in 2016 to mark his departure from Oxford, they called it Uncertain Futures, Essays about the Irish Past for Roy Foster. And this title, I think, beautifully captures the essence of Roy's work. Hindsight, as is well known, is both a blessing and a curse for historians. It allows us to detect large structural patterns that people in the past may have known little or nothing about. But for that very reason, it can also blind us to how they experience their world. As Roy puts it in one of his own essays, history, quote, is at its most illuminating when written with full consciousness of what people wrongly expected to happen. Full consciousness of what people wrongly expected to happen. In his writing, therefore, Roy always insists on keeping things open-ended. He is well versed in social and political and literary theory, but he resists the temptation to package the past into preconceived conceptual boxes. The hallmark of his scholarship for me is his emphasis on contingency, complexity, and the unexpected possibilities of the past, combined always with deep attention to literary style in historical writing. In today's event, my colleague, Dr. Kelly Sullivan, will interview Roy Foster about his new book on Seamus Heaney. After that, we'll open things up to a general discussion. And we invite you to pose questions and comments using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Indeed, I see we have 7 such entries of various kinds already. So please don't feel you have to wait until the end. Anything that occurs along the way, enter comments or questions in progress. Let me now introduce Kelly Sullivan. Kelly is a clinical associate professor here at NYU in our Center for Irish and Irish American Studies in Glucksman Ireland House. Her areas of specialty are literary modernism and late modernism, with a focus on fiction and poetry in the 1930s and 1940s. She also works on modern Irish art and on the connections between literary and visual arts movements in Ireland in the 20th century, on contemporary Irish poetry, and most recently in her writing and teaching on the genre of eco-critical literature. Kelly has published several essays, articles and chapters in these areas. She also writes and publishes her own poetry. So thank you very much, and over to you, Kelly.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I wanted to start off by saying what a pleasure it is to be speaking with you today, Roy, about your new and exciting book on Seamus Heaney. And I should just flag that there is a discount code for purchasing the book. It's available in the chat if you haven't already seen that. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I wanted to start out by saying that I was really struck by the book's versatility. It offers an overview of Heaney's life and his career as a poet, but in a way that's really accessible, I think, both to a reader who's unfamiliar with his work and intriguing and valuable to readers who are more familiar with his career. You've used some newly available archives and letters, and you've highlighted some of the important aesthetic shifts that in his work, in his poetry, and indeed in his lecturing over the course of his career. So I wanted to ask you, I guess, how you came to the book. The book is both and respectful of privacy. So I'm wondering how the book came about and how you happened upon a structure for it.
Thanks, Kelly, and thank you, Kevin, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be back, if only virtually, at Ireland House, where I've had so many good and stimulating times in the past and hope to do so in the future. How did the book come about? How do books come about? You're sometimes asked to write them, and that was partly what happened this way. I had written about Seamus Heaney in The Observer after he died, and the editor at Princeton University Press said, would I think of doing a short book in their series, Writers on Writers? And I said, yes. I think I first of all thought it would be a different kind of book than the one it turned out to be, but it ended up being, as you pointed out, both a chronological and a biographical, and in a sense, a critical survey, stitched to the poems and to the life as it unfolded. I suppose I am a biographer, and that's the way I think. But there were other matters at issue as well about why I wrote it in the way I did. And it took longer than I thought for such a short book, partly because, as you say, there is new archival work in it, but partly also because I wanted to wait till I felt I had the tone right and was in control, or more or less in control, of such a rich and complex seam of writing and thought as Heaney left behind him.
The tone is certainly, I think, important in this book, and as you say, it's in the Writers on Writers series, and you're writing about a writer who had control of his work and his writing and incredible range as well. So I wonder how you did that involve sitting down and just sort of rereading all of the volumes of poetry? Was that part of the process?
It sort of was, and it was rereading because I'm 10 years younger than Heaney was. So I grew up reading the books as they came out, first of all as, I guess, a student or a graduate student, and then increasingly older. And when I looked back on the framework that the books presented to me sequentially, that suggested a framework for the book. And that's not the way you read about them. You read them at the time. It's only when you go back to them and read them sequentially that you see that how much each book stands on the shoulders of the one before it. And I suppose that is what I mean by going back and rereading.
That was something I very much appreciated about your book, that you clarify how much the volumes come one after the next, how they respond to each other and speak to each other across his career. I know you accessed new archival material. In seeing drafts of his poems and letters, has that shaped your sense of Heaney's poetry, or reshaped your sense of Heaney's work or of his career at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And also they bring back the man. His letters are wonderful. Christopher Reid is doing a big edition of them, and they will be fantastic. They're so funny, they're mischievous, they're scabrous in some ways. He peppers them with wonderful little poems, off-the-cuff poems for his friends, some of them extremely rude. And the vitality of his enormous personality comes through. But also looking at the drafts, and I think you've worked on drafts of North yourself, Kelly, you realize what it grows out of. He said himself his first 4 books were one book leading up to North. I think of it very differently. When I read the drafts of the poems in Wintering Out, I hear a completely new voice, and it's a voice that anticipates what's going to burst out in North. when you see the drafts of titles, which he changes over and over again. There's a very good article to be written, well, maybe it's been written, on Heaney and titles and how they change and emerge. North, for instance, originally was going to be called The North, which to anyone who knows politics in Ireland carries a different kind of valency. It's the way that Southerners refer to the North, and it has a political implication. It was then going to be called Northerners, which again gives a totally different heft to what the book is going to be about. And finally, he hits on this one syllable North, which brings in Nordic, Viking, Denmark, all that, which is we're going to find studied into the book as well. And it shows how he works on till he hits the mot juste in the poems, but also in the titles.
I imagine going through that archival material also gave you a sense of the work behind, I mean, you're describing some of the work behind the poems, which seem, in a sense, effortless on the page. And I guess that's partially the point of them, but certainly there's labor involved.
Well, there's great labor, very Yeatsian reference, you know, you must labor to be beautiful, and the work. And I think one of the instances where Heaney relates to Yeats as an example, as he says at one point, is the work that goes into Yeats's crafting of his poetry, and the whole thing in Yeats's Adam's Curse about the craft, the hardness of writing a perfect line and how long it will take.
If we shift a little bit into the volumes of poetry themselves, certainly the book's biographically inflected, but you really stick to the poetry as the kind of the primary source material, despite, you know, you've looked at the archives, but it's you have a kind of respectful distance there. I'm wondering if you have a different appreciation after writing this book for the way that Heaney's life shaped his poetry, his experiences shaped the volumes of poetry themselves, or vice versa.
Well, it's a tricky question, as you well know, whether the I in a poet, in a poem is the I of the poet, the personality of the poet, or whether it's a persona. And again, rather like Yeats, who chooses, especially, well, both early and late in his career, with Aid early in his career, with Crazy Jane late in his career, he chooses personae through whom he can speak. Heaney does this as well. He chooses Sweeney, famously, the flitting bird king of Irish legend. And some of the Sweeney poems are an evasion, I think, well, evasion of all sorts of things, but they're also Heaney himself. And when you look again at the first drafts, you get clues to this. It isn't just Sweeney, it's Heaney Sweeney, as he himself remarked. But set against this, there is the powerful autobiographical weight of poems like Clearances, the sonnets about his mother, the Glanmore sonnets, the transposition of personal life and personal experience. And many of the poems in his first breakthrough book, Death of a Naturalist, do this as well. He's at the same time complicating and reifying and shaping experience, as all writers do. And I think it's one reason why Wordsworth means so much to him from the very beginning of his career to the end. And Wordsworth and personality and place and identity and nature and how you grow up against these things and how they shape you for life is instinct in Heaney's work throughout. And reading through the whole corpus of work, the other thing that struck me was the almost circularity with which he comes back to first things in the end. It's one of the great pleasures of reading the work as a conspectus. And it's one of the ways in which gave me the shape of the book as it emerged.
Yeah, I think that comes clear in a really lovely way in the book, the connections, particularly between Death of a Naturalist and District and Circle and different themes that it comes back to. Your comment about nature and place makes me think of the tree that Heaney, I can't remember the poem, but where Heaney sort of likens himself or has an affinity with a tree planted when he's a child that gets cut down.
That's in Clearances, yes. It's actually the poem I end the book with, though it's by no means his last poem.
And then also the death of his brother that comes back in, and of course his relationship with his parents in different ways. All of these kind of formative early experiences and early poems that almost seem reworked in the end in different ways.
They're reworked, but they're also a process. I was very struck by a phrase the novelist and poet actually, Margaret Atwood, used in a celebrated lecture in Cambridge, where she said that all writing was a conversation with the dead. And Heaney's poetry becomes increasingly a conversation with the dead, with his parents, with his younger brother who was killed in a car accident outside the house, with the dead of classical literature, and with dead friends. He writes many, many elegies for friends, from Robert Lowell to Czesław Miłosz. But the conversations with the dead is a theme that I hadn't expected to be so struck by until I immersed myself in the work. And as you absolutely rightly say, towards the end, in poems like Album, in many of the poems in Human Chain, a very significantly titled book, his last collection, are about going back to find a resolution with his father especially, but also other people who have died and crossed the Styx, in the classical metaphor, which he will keep returning to as well.
Yeah. Speaking of loss and death, there are a number of significant poets who have died in the last year or 2 years who were either Heaney's contemporaries or near contemporaries. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the impact of friendships, or the significance of poetic friendships in his life and career, and maybe how those poets helped shape his poetry, how those relationships shaped his writing.
Well, that's not an article, Kelly, that's a book, as you well know. And it begins very early on with his friends in the group who get together in Belfast in the lecturer Philip Hobsbawm's house to discuss their craft. And Michael Longley is there, later Stuart Parker is there, Paul Muldoon is there. And the people whom Heaney knows and influences are extremely important poets in their own right. Think of Muldoon, think of Kieran Carson, think of Maeve McGuckie, and the people, Tom Paulin, the people who grew up not in his shadow as people grew up in Yeats's shadow, but grew up being stimulated and often taught by him. That's vital. But there's also the world of poetry and poets that he meets when he goes to teach at Berkeley for a year and then returns, when he goes to Harvard, when he travels, as he incessantly does. And the poets from Eastern Europe like Herbert and Milosz, the poets from America, poets from England as well. He's very, very close, as is well known, to Ted Hughes. They edit a book together. They're very close friends. His trade and the people who practiced it were very important to him. And he was, I think, a very generous critic, and very generous both with his time and with his expertise. And actually, somebody was telling me that when they were a student at Oxford, and Heaney was giving the wonderful lectures which were published as the redress of poetry, he attended student barnstorming sessions about writing poetry. And they were organized, these sessions, about a type of poem. You know, there'd be a meeting where everyone tried to do a villanelle, there'd be a meeting where people tried to do a certain kind of lyric. And there was one meeting where they did a sestina, this very difficult poetic form. And Heaney said very quietly, I've actually just written a sestina. And he read them 2 lorries, which is one of his most perfectly accomplished poems. And to have heard that read by him, as my friend said, well, we just silently shut up our notebooks, thinking of their attempts to crack this difficult form. But it's a very Heaney story. He was very generous in giving and sharing and influencing, and he was an enormous influence.
I want to ask about Yeats, but before I ask about Yeats, I want to stick with that question of influence for a minute, because there's certainly a significant generation or generations now of younger poets writing potentially in Heaney's shadow. I'm wondering if you see how you see Heaney influencing those younger generations, and maybe that leads us to the Yeats question as well.
Well, it does, because Austin Clarke, who was the generation after Yeats, said it was like growing up in the shadow of an oak tree that took all the nurture out of the ground around it. Very pawky kind of thing for Austin Clarke to say, but Austin Clarke was rather gloomy person. Heaney did not cast that kind of shadow. And as I've said already, there was a generation of poets who were taught by him and learned from him. I think the poets who are writing now, and Irish poetry is at a very, as you know, active and golden moment in some ways. I think they've been liberated by the amplitude of Heaney's vision and by the way that he could move from classically inflected, very serious verse to something more larky and personal. I think of a poet like Martina Evans, whose work I like very much, who has in fact written a poem called Oysters. And she said, I dared to write a poem called Oysters, even though Seamus Heaney had written a poem called Oysters. And that's what I mean about his influence being liberating, not limiting. And actually what I call the larky tone in some of Heaney's work, you'll hear echoed, I think in Martina Evans's work as well, sometimes in Paula Meehan's too. I think he's there as an example, not to inhibit, but to expand horizons. And that's how I think his influence has happened.
Well, that brings us to the significant influence of Yeats on Heaney's work, or at least I mean, there's so many connections between the two poets and potentially parallels in their presence as kind of national figures, as the political pressures that they felt. Could you talk a little bit about the way you see Heaney learning from Yeats and what he, not just as a poet, but also as a public figure, I suppose?
Yes, I think you're right that the influence is there all the time, but Heaney is quite reluctant to have it made too manifest or too obvious or too much invoked by other people. He gives a very good early lecture that's then an essay called Yeats as an Example, and there's a query mark after example. He drops the query a bit later when he talks about Yeats, but early on he's also slightly inhibited, I think, because people like Robert Lowell and Clive James keep saying this is the greatest Irish poet since Yeats, and that stuff begins very early, and that not only could be an inhibiting thing on Heaney, it could be extremely annoying for other Irish poets. You know, there's a tendency for English critics and possibly American critics in the 60s and 70s to write as if there isn't Thomas Kinsella, there isn't Ivan Boland, there isn't Michael Longley, and they're all writing, there isn't John Montagu, and these people are all writing at the same time as Heaney and are all marvelous poets. And Derek Mahon, of course, as you mentioned as well. We've lost Mahon and Boland recently, and it brings all this even more vividly to mind. But Heaney is always seen as Yeats's inheritor. When he wins the Nobel Prize, of course, then the parallel becomes even stronger. Mm-hmm. And he's very careful about this. When his wonderful lecture accepting the Nobel Prize, crediting poetry, refers to Yeats and to Yeats's meditations in time of civil war, very specifically towards the end. And it places himself and Yeats as poets writing about violence, bitterness, horrors, at the same time as appealing to something more life-enhancing and fulfilling that will somehow endure. The stars nest by my window in Yeats's great image in Meditations. And I think he feels there's a fellow feeling with Yeats which he can absorb and allow by then. But by then he's become what I've called the national poet. And I think that's I don't know if you'd agree, but I think it's a more comprehensible concept in Irish intellectual life, certainly than it is in England, where there's no such notion. They have a poet laureate, but that's, alas, an extremely different thing from being a national poet. The idea of having a poet who expresses the national culture and inflects it and influences it and wields authority within it is something you'd find much more in Poland or in France, or actually in Russia. And I think that's the world that Heaney is intersecting with. At the end of my book, I do consider this, especially in the light of the astonishing reaction to his death in Ireland, where he had achieved this authority. And I go back to Yeats's distinction between nations being vain or proud. And they're vain as long as they're insecure, and they're proud when they no longer mind about their faults being held up to the world's examination. And this made me think very closely and vividly of what Seamus Heaney had done and what he represented and how he represented Ireland to the world.
I wonder, I was really, the chapter where you write about the funeral and kind of the national and international reaction to Heaney's death, I think is very moving. And this may just be my own personal sense of that moment, having, I remember it vividly. I do wonder if Heaney thought of himself as a national poet, or if that's a kind of, if that's a backward look, like a backward assessment, if that makes sense. An assessment we can only make in the wake of his death, and that moment of kind of almost unity. I mean, I think you describe it as a form of coming together. I don't know, I'm curious what you think of Heaney, if Heaney would consider himself a national poet.
Yeah, he couldn't not have had an inkling of it, that was how he was seen. Yeah. But one of the themes in my book, as you know, is evasion, and he evades being nailed down, just like Sweeney, actually, his alter ego. And I think if you declared yourself a national poet, it would be suicidal. You would be nailing yourself down. But he was so famous, and he looked like nobody else, and he sounded like nobody else. His daughter Catherine tells a lovely story of him walking along the street and in Dublin, and some young fellow passes him, his girlfriend, and says, as they pass Heaney, "There he is, your man." And that was enough. Even if the young fellow couldn't quite remember he was called Seamus Heaney, he knew that he was your man, which he most certainly was. But he steered clear of being put too much in that public space. There were endless rumors that he would end up as president of Ireland and all that sort of thing. I'm convinced he never would have, that he never would have actually entered a gilded cage. He was evasive about being a spokesman for anything, even though his poetry is effectively, it does that task where and how it needs to be done, but not in a kind of attitudinizing way. It's a very difficult path to tread, but he did it with extreme delicacy. And in spite of the sledgehammer effect of so much of his work, he's also, and this is true of, especially I think of his love poetry, he's a very delicate kind of poet.
In relation to that, that desire to be both, well, to evade too much of he's not evading a public role, but being a spokesperson for anything. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the pressures he felt after winning the Nobel Prize, which certainly mounted, I can imagine, and you describe some of this in the book. And did you see that changing his writing at all? How do you think he kind of handled those pressures?
The pressures mounted, but they'd always been there. I mean, there are pressures, and they're reflected in some of the letters he writes when he has moved to Wicklow in 1972, and he's criticized for leaving Northern Ireland. And he writes very defensive private letters about this, and some of his poems from that era, which aren't published, are also defensive. And of course, the wonderful closing of North, the wood kern in the trees, watching things, is also a sign of evasion and of not doing what you're expected. After the Nobel, it was a different kind of pressure, but it was a pressure he had to take on to a certain extent. He was very generous in every way, and I think he found it hard to turn down the endless invitations that came his way to express or to speak in memory of somebody, or to be the representative of, I guess, Irish poetry and indeed increasingly world poetry. His stroke in 2006, I think, was a warning sign, which I think came at a time when he was taking on an enormous amount of duties, which he then had the excuse not to, but he still, I think, gave of himself very, very freely. And he writes complainingly about this, but he still walks the walk and talks the talk.
I know we have a lot of questions in the chat, and I want to move us into those. I just want to ask one last question, kind of about the end of your book and Heaney's legacy, which I think is related to this theme we've been on. You write that his work may profitably and triumphantly be read as reflecting the strategies and decisions which he employed to carve out various kinds of independence and to combine intellectual ability with a certain creative evasiveness, as well as a darkening vision which has perhaps had its due. And I wanted to ask you about that darkening vision and kind of allow you to give it a bit more of its due, I suppose.
Yes, that's perceptive. I was expecting I'd get something about that when I published that reflection. The darkening vision, I think, I would defend that view of his work. There's two levels it works on. One is that he was, as who can not be, intensely worried about the state of the world, especially since 9/11. And his poem, Anything Can Happen, which is a reflection of that, is a poem about not only the possibility, but the unpredictability, we're back to what Kevin was saying in his introductory remarks, of apocalypse. And it's a very chilling and powerful reflection of that. There's a poem of his I particularly like, a late poem, it's in District and Circle, called Out of Shot, which is a sonnet about having seen the news the night before with an atrocity happening in the Middle East and working it through his mind as he leans on a farm gate in Wicklow, looking at Wicklow Bay. And it's a marvelously accomplished poem, which also shows just how attuned he was to the larger world, far from Wicklow, but full of the kind of violence and explosive murder which he had known in his youth or his young manhood in Northern Ireland. But the darkening vision is also his intense preoccupation with what I've earlier called crossing the sticks, the underground. He returns again in District and Circle, as he has done in an earlier beautiful love poem called The Underground, to the image of London's subway system as being analogous to Hades, and running to the proms, the concerts when he's on his honeymoon with his wife, and they're late, and the buttons start falling off a new coach he's bought as they run along the corridors of the underground. And he thinks, of course, of Hansel and Gretel, but he thinks of Orpheus and Eurydice too, and Damned If I Look Back. And that image of being lost in Hades and losing people to Charon, the boatman. Again, it comes up in the wonderful late poem, Route 110, which traces the dead and is again conversations with the dead. Ever since, I think, those later volumes, Seeing Things and the spirit level, he is working on this seam. And of course, it squares with Dante, it squares with Virgil. And to me, the great expression of it is Station Island, which is in a way the hinge of my book. And I think it's a hinge poem in his career, where he produces an extraordinary range of reflections on the people who have influenced him, the people he has known, the writers who have influenced him, but he casts it in the image, a very Virgilian image of a pilgrimage through the world of the dead. And if that's not conducive to a darkening vision, I don't know what is.
So I'm glad to hear you talk about some of his poems that are in response to politics, but not Northern Ireland, not Irish politics at all, in fact, and that the shift that I think many of us lived through in the early 2000s and the rise of, the era of global terrorism, I suppose. And I think he has some great poems that kind of respond to that and engage with that. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to turn us to some of those. And I guess one of the earliest questions we have is to ask you if you could talk a bit more about Heaney's relationship with Miloš, which I know comes up in your book.
Yes, I'm not the person best qualified to do this. That would be my friend Eva Hoffman, who's writing a book in this series on Miloš, in fact. He was in Berkeley at the same time as Miloš in the late 60s and 70s, and Miloš was in Berkeley for, I think, about 20 years, about 1970, 1990, but oddly they don't seem to have met then. They did later, and in Eastern Europe. And I think poems like From the Canton of Expectation, From the Frontier of Writing, remind me very much of the sort of poetry Milosz was writing back then, and which I know Heaney must have read. They became friends. He went to Milosz's funeral. Was a very powerful moment for him. And I've heard this from various people who knew him, that he came back from Krakow very, very astonished by that moment and what it meant to him. They both, I think, negotiate religion, nationalism, politics, and independence. And for both of them, America is a kind of roosting place that they can fly away to and see their own country and their own places from a new vantage. And they both have, well, what I've just said, a delicacy of touch. I think Milosz has that delicacy as well. But wait for Eva Hoffman's book. It's going to be terrific.
Another question has to do with the balance between adulation and criticism of Heaney in your book, and that it shifts as one gets closer to home. Could you tell us a bit more about the Belfast literary world out of which Heaney was writing, and his evolving relationship to that world?
Well, that's a very pointed question. Balance of adulation and criticism. I mean, my book, if that's what it means, isn't entirely adulatory, and there are volumes of his that speak to me much less than others. I think Electric Light is a bit of a wobble. I'm not a Beowulf fan, but that may have more to do with Beowulf than with Heaney. I think his instincts, he was asked by his friend Carl Miller, are you as nice as you seem? And he said, I have been cursed with a set of fairly decent impulses. And I think the fairly decent impulses are so powerful in him that I may err, if your questioner thinks that, on the side of lack of a criticism there. To move to the other part of that question, again, a quotation, Dr. Johnson said the Irish are a very fair people because they never speak well of one another. And that could be applied to certain literary circles in Ireland. Heaney, again, by his marvelously glissant quality of being able to slide past, and he says this in his great book of interviews, Stepping Stones, you know, you get by ignoring it, perhaps with an unspoken fuck you too, buddy, which he'd learned from John McGahern. And so there is that element there too. But I think the surprising thing is how little rancor he attracted, except from pretty inconsequential journalistic critics who always wanted to have a go at anyone, you know, tall poppy syndrome. Among his peers and among those who knew what he was doing and knew how hard it was to do it as well as he did it, he maintained, I think, enormously affectionate and respectful and respected relationships.
To shift gears a little bit, I have a question about form. So the question is, I can see that Heaney respected traditional forms, rhyme, and metrics, yet he seemed to make his own forms like squarings or his sonnets with their slant rhyme and rough metrics. Do you know why he didn't proceed in a totally traditional way with respect to these poetic tools? What was the impulse to experiment?
That's a very good question, and I wish I could answer it. Yeah, he will remain wedded to the sonnet form, though often dealing with it very freely. He will use tercets he's very fond of. As I've said earlier, he can manipulate a sestina into an astonishingly effective form, as in two lorries. But that thin line, sometimes even two words to a line, that you get as you move through his poems, and some of the poems in Human Chain are like this, are very, I think, experimental. I think he's partly getting this from Gaelic poetry, which he knew a lot about and which he did versions and translations of, and which has that absolutely acid economy of line. Things are etched in a very few words. And this is something he was very interested in. I can't answer the question as to why the experimental impulse either came when it did or wasn't taken further than it was. But it's possible that he couldn't have answered that question either.
A very specific question about manuscripts. Did you come across the manuscripts from the Bell and his Queen's days that are at Laurel Villa in Magherafelt?
Yes, I did. I was just looking at my notes from them the other day, and his poems from Gorgon, the magazine, the Queen's University magazine. Yes, I was shown them generously by Eugene Kelt, who has a collection of them in Laurel Villa, and I found them extremely interesting. It's the young Heaney, the Heaney who's acting in student productions, the Heaney who is trying out prose as well as poetry. He was writing short stories, a couple of which were published in those sort of publications. He actually goes back to writing fiction when he's in Berkeley, around 1970, but he never publishes any of it. It's when he's meeting American writers like Lenny Michaels, who he's a great friend of, and who inspires him to try fiction again. So yes, I did come across those very interesting early items and profited by them.
Maybe a somewhat related question, which I think you actually commented on earlier, but we could reaffirm. The question is that it's wonderful to read a few of his letters in the book, and are there plans for a selected or a collected letters?
Yes, Christopher Reid, himself a fine poet and a friend of Seamus's, is editing a big edition of them. And you're quite right, there are wonderful letters in Emery, in the Friel collection in the National Library, and they are terrific. If I could have quoted lots of them, I would, but my book is not a biography. It's a biographical treatment of his work. The biography will be written, and I think marvelously written, by Fintan O'Toole, and I hope we'll have lots of letters in that.
Another question related to, maybe bring us back to the national poet question, but how valid is it to write about Irish or British or American poets in scare quotes? Is this not too limiting? Are we pigeonholing people by calling Heaney Irish, for example?
I can see the force of that, but when the work comes out so clearly of various Irish traditions, although, as we've said in this discussion, Kelly, and you yourself have said it, it goes out into the world and picks up all sorts of other soundings and valences. I think to see him as an Irish poet is forgivable. And look at the open letter to Blake Morrison and Andrew Motion when he was described as a British poet, and he very much identifies himself as an Irish poet. And that open letter, again, a larky piece of work, but a deadly serious one, I think shows how he self-identified. And I'm prepared to go along with him in that.
It makes me think of two kind of divergent points. One, some critics have picked up on, I think they're calling it a kind of international style in Heaney's poetry, particularly in later volumes, a language that allows the poems to speak. I mean, I think all poetry should do this, but allows the poems to speak to kind of an international audience, I guess. But then I'm also struck by I think it's his sister-in-law, I don't remember her name, but the writer who said after Heaney's funeral that Heaney's poetry helps us remember words and language that's very much rooted in the very specific place he's from. So I wonder, I don't know, that's more of a comment, I guess, than a question.
Yeah, that was Polly Devlin, herself a fine writer, who said, who knows what a greeth on a horse is? Who knows what measles shins mean? It's the red spots you get on your bare legs when you sit in front of a coal fire. These brilliantly observed minutiae of a way of life that was gone, but remembered because many, many Irish people have a country background. And it's that country background that he reminded them of. But that's only part of his effect, as well as we've just said, discussing the last question. There is an enormously wide range of power and effect to his poetry, which isn't just reminding people of a world that's gone, though that is a small part of it. I was very struck when I went back to the first two books, Death of a Naturalist and Door into the Dark, which I'd always assumed were or remembered as being charming pastoral. Mm-hmm. And then you get, first of all, in Wintering Out, and then in North, this astonishing, bleak, savage, what I call a shocking panache And then when I went back to the first two books, I thought, well, actually, it's there. You can see it there. You can see the violence. You can see the darkness. You can see the brutality. It's of a piece. So there is a continuity there, I think, and it's not just, as I say, charming pastoral reminding us of a world that's gone. It's also a darkening vision. We're back with that.
Yeah. A clarification on the earlier question, which I may have botched in trying to pass it along to you, but the question about adulation and criticism was meant to be an appraisal of Heaney's contemporaries and their of Heaney's poetry and Heaney, not your book. But anyway, apologies for myself for botching that. Mine. There's a question on chronology. So on your work on Yeats, you wrote from the viewing of someone you wrote from the view of someone who is long dead. Seamus didn't pass away all that long ago. Did that shape your approach, his relatively recent death?
That shaped my approach, as did the fact that I knew him. Not well, I wasn't an intimate, but I was a friend. And that does lend a kind of inhibition. But I don't think it's an unmanning kind of or a disempowering kind of inhibition. It simply makes you tread more carefully than you might have and think of. The upside is you bring your own perceptions. I mean, I never met Yeats. He died 10 years before I was born. Seamus was born 10 years before I was born. And you're connecting with somebody much more directly. The distance that is imposed by writing about somebody who's dead, and somebody whose family, as the Yeats family said to me, Michael Yeats, with extraordinary, his son, generosity, said to me, I don't want to read a word you've written until it's in print. I want to reserve the right to dislike it, he said, but not to censor it. And that's very rare. Most people guard the shrine. And there is a shrine to be guarded. But I have to say the Heaney family have been extraordinarily generous, both with material and access and all that. Though, as I say, this isn't the authorized biography, it's a very different kind of book. But they are in charge of a great inheritance. And it's very significant that the National Library in Ireland has two permanent exhibitions. One, the great exhibition in the main building on the life of Yeats, the other in the old Bank of Ireland building on the life of Heaney. And these are permanent exhibitions. That again brings us back to the status of Heaney as national poet following Yeats.
A question about your own research and writing. Biggest surprise to you in researching for this book?
I'm sorry, your voice went there for a minute, Kelly. Could you?
The question is, what was the biggest surprise to you in writing this book?
There were a number, I think, but I think the main one was the anger in some of the early poems from the late 60s, which are unpublished and probably rightly unpublished because they're rough and they're rough hewn. And they are full of the anger of a young Catholic from a moderate nationalist background, seeing what's happening to the part of the island he lives in. I was very struck by these poems, and I imagine his biographer will make a great deal of them too. But the reason why they're not published is, I think, because they are too angry to be good poems. And I think the craft of his poetry has to be remembered there. He did write, these are poems from the same period as when he writes for the commander of the Eliza at a potato digging. When he writes actually, or tries to write a long radio play about 1798, he is immersed in the late 1960s in a kind of mother lode of nationalist historical material, which I find fascinating. And in a private letter around this time, he writes that to him, politics and history are indistinguishable. And when I read that, I thought, gosh, because I hadn't thought of him thinking like that. And then I read that quite early in my researches, and that, I think, rather inflected the way I looked at his work from then on.
I am balancing multiple devices with questions. a question is, do you have a favorite Heaney poem? And I might actually add to that, is there one volume that now stands out to you as especially significant, but maybe hasn't received its due?
Favorite poem is impossible. I mean, horses for courses. There are, of his family poems, I love Album, in the last book about trying to connect with his dead father. I love Out of Shot, as I've said, because I think it's so accomplished and so surprising. But I think Station Island is the sequence I come back to over and over again. But the more I look into those volumes, the more beauties there are, and it would be very difficult to make a desert island decision. The volume would be Station Island, not only because of the title poem, which I love, but also because it has the Sweeney poems, especially Sweeney Redivivus, which is a sort of poem about biography towards the end, and about one's people being too anxious to hear my story, even if it happens to be true, which rang a bell with me.
Is there a collected poems planned, or complete poems? Do you know?
Yes, I think there is. But I can't remember who's editing, but yes, there is, and there must be.
Maybe a final question, or kind of, final question. Towards the end of your book, you mention Heaney's last text or last words, Noli Timara, to his wife, and you call this his final manifesto, so the Latin for "don't be afraid." And of course, he wasn't saying this in the bombastic manner maybe of a contemporary politician, but with the grace of a real writer. So what do you think Heaney's poetry and legacy offers to us right now you wrote this book before the pandemic, in our kind of uncertain moment of continuing crisis?
Gosh, I think it offers us an access to what he calls early on the subtleties and tolerances which make life possible. He said that in terms of social relations in Northern Ireland in the dark times of the 70s. But I think subtleties and tolerances are a large part of what his own work encourages us to believe in. It's a rather inadequate word, but decency, I think, is an enormous part of what he conveys in his take on the world and on life. Decency and listening, because his poems are the poems of a listener. Noise, a sound, is wonderfully reproduced in them. And poems like The Rainstick are about noise and sound and listening. And he encourages us to listen instead of to shout. But I do think of him a lot in terms of the state that the world is in at the moment and what he had to offer as a counteracting impulse to what we're surrounded with, both you mentioned the pandemic, but there's also the parlous state of high politics in the world today. And perhaps could I read a poem actually that illustrates that, just to end it. It's a poem called From the Republic of Conscience. And it was written for prisoners of conscience, the prisoners of conscience activities of the amnesty movement. And I think it expresses a kind of vision of politics and a vision of life, which is sadly lacking in many countries at the moment. From the Republic of Conscience. When I landed in the Republic of Conscience, it was so noiseless when the engine stopped, I could hear a curlew high above the runway. At immigration, the clerk was an old man who produced a wallet from his homespun coat and showed me a photograph of my grandfather. The woman in customs asked me to declare the words of our traditional cures and charms to heal dumbness and avert the evil eye. No porters, no interpreter, no taxi. You carried your own burden, and very soon your symptoms of creeping privilege disappeared. Fog is a dreaded omen there, but lightning spells universal good, and parents hang swaddled infants in trees during thunderstorms. Salt is their precious mineral, and seashells are held to the ear during births and funerals. The base of all inks and pigments is seawater. Their sacred symbol is a stylized boat. The sail is an ear, the mast a sloping pen, the hull a mouth shape, the keel an open eye. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep to atone for their presumption to hold office, and to affirm their faith that all life sprang from salt in tears, which the sky god wept after he dreamt his solitude was endless. I came back from that frugal republic with my 2 arms the one length, the customs woman having insisted my allowance was myself. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said that was official recognition that I was now a dual citizen. He therefore desired me, when I got home, to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own tongue. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and thank you so much for today's conversation. I'll just remind everyone again that the book is available through the Princeton University Press website, and there is a code for a discount and free shipping in the chat. Thanks again, Roy.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Ireland House and Columbia. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon, everyone.